Hello, Heather Davis here. I'm the Program Director Awards at LH Martin Institute here at the University of Melbourne. I'm joined today by Frances Valintine, an alumna from our Master of Tertiary Education and Management, who graduated in 2013. Welcome, Frances, and welcome back to Melbourne.
Thanks, Heather.
Now, Frances, just by way of background, you are currently the founder and chairperson of MindLab by Unitec in New Zealand. Before that, you were CEO of media design for many years, and you've also are a director of an education consultancy, Harper Lilly. So it just strikes me that education seems to be a really big values driver for you in your work. Is that how you see it as well?
Look, I think education was something I sort of almost fell into 22 years ago now. And initially in export education, I was looking at promoting New Zealand offshore to bring international students to the country. And through that process, I actually ended up in the technology sector and got very excited about what technology could do in terms of transforming a person's ability to access education. And realised at that point in time that there was a tipping point, and this is back in the late 90s, and the ability to actually can bring together those two passions, the real interest in technology and where it was going, but also how it was going to impact on technology and how it would redefine what knowledge is. You know, what is the purpose of knowledge? And you know, it became quite a philosophical kind of thought for me, I think, in terms of the driver really was this passion for empowering people to learn more, but actually understanding that we really wanted to contextualise education in tomorrow's world and not just look back at a legacy model that perhaps had had its day.
And do you think that, it's often said about Australia, but I imagine it'd be very similar in New Zealand, that we're very early adopters around technology by dint of the fact that we're a long way away from the rest of the world, and it kind of helps us bring the world a bit closer together. Do you have that sense around maybe that was part of the reason or not, around your interest in technology, around that accessibility and opportunity that these changes in technology that you could foresee might be able to give for the country of New Zealand as well?
Look, I think we, as a small nation, and certainly like in Australia, you know, the distance to market and distance to, you know, to find knowledge and to meet people, you know, that anything that can speed up or make that process easier is a great enabler. What probably got me more interested was I could see this shift in technology becoming more and more sort of intuitive, but actually as technology became more intuitive, we became consumers of technology, which got me very concerned that actually the benefits of technology is actually how do you maximise it to use it as a tool to make, you know, increase your knowledge, increase your access, collaborate more. And I saw for a period of time this diminishing kind of curiosity about what technology could do, and social media sort of came into the marketplace and almost came in at a time when you know, iPads came in and smartphones and Wi-Fi, and so suddenly I think technology was seen almost as an entertainment platform, and that got me quite concerned that we were almost losing the ability to, as we would say, look under the bonnet and see what else it could do.
Yes. Can you tell us about what a typical day for you looks like?
Well, my days are very varied. So now we have 6 locations across New Zealand, so I could be in any one of our locations. We're teaching every day school groups who come into the MindLab by Unitec to learn all around new technologies. So any part of the day I could be interfacing with parents and teachers and children. But then we also, at the evenings after school hours, teachers come in to learn digital and collaborative learning as a part of a postgraduate program. And so I have a team across the country, but we also have people who are facilitating all over the world. We're looking forward, looking into the future, where is technology going, but actually most importantly, where is it impacting with education? You know, what does it look like in 5 years, given the uptake of technology in developing countries, but also looking at access to Wi-Fi is increasing dramatically. So the student audience is becoming massive. You know, it's increasing at a rate that we've never seen, and by the end of next year we see another leaps and bounds ahead in that space.
I know from the capstone that we were involved with together when you're doing the MTEM, you did quite a good and detailed literature review into what might be happening with technology, and that was only completed in 2013. So was it close, you know, or have things moved a lot more quickly even than you had kind of foreseen with that prospective look at what might be around technology?
I think fundamentally the track I was on was correct, but the technology superseded any of my expectations.
Right, yeah.
And what really happened is that in 2013, it was really the early stages of MOOCs being sort of taken a little more seriously. And I wasn't sure how that would fit in terms of the future. What I now realise is the MOOCs product, for example, is very good for adults. You know, I say it's an old person's product for old people. So it's delivering a traditional lecture-based chalk and talk model online. This next generation, of course, are not going to be interested in that model at all. They're much more savvy, they're much more wanting to collaborate, much more wanting to socialise as well. And so I think we're going to see and starting to see a new model of online learning which will be developed by young people for young people, which will have overlays of a lot more interaction both face-to-face but also online, but utilising some of the very best tools. I couldn't have foreseen that even 2 years ago, and partially because the technologies had advanced so much faster than I expected, but also just the uptake of mobile technology and mobile phones and how far they've gone, and really changing that scene. And I think that where we're at right now is at the cusp of something quite exciting, where not only we'll have access, students around the world as high school graduates have access to the very best platforms and the very best experts and the very best research. I think that they're going to have access which will be increasingly faster and more efficient, more accessible. And so it's a challenge for all of us. How do we keep our next generation engaged with education when it's changing so rapidly?
And how do we stay relevant? By the sound, there's a strong message there for educators about, young people designing their learning for other young people.
Well, I think what's really interesting is if you go into our primary schools, and they'll be exactly the same here, primary schools have been working around an inquiry-based model for the last, up to the last decade, depending on where they are, which is very hands-on, collaborative, project-based. It's often linked to the industry. It's got lots of context. You're learning this because of this.
Yes.
And students have learned to really work together. Primary schools, of course, are very strong in uptake of Wi-Fi. They often have shared devices, which again helps them to collaborate. Now, those primary school students will hit our high schools for the first time next year. Right. So they're 12 years old and under. So if you're looking at the evolution of smart technology.
Yes.
So they have never had a traditional classroom. And so now they're going to go from, in the most case, from a very kind of open modern learning environments with quite a different sort of scaffolding approach to learning into a traditional environment with siloed subjects and driven by learning content and not context. So I think what we're going to face with that is really a very quick shift and of need and responsiveness to those students, because they'll walk. I think that's the reality, is they'll walk to find something more relevant if it doesn't work for them. And I think the next couple of years will be very interesting.
Well, I think that's also food for thought for the next stage for tertiary education, because we're going to see the effects of that between primary and secondary, and hopefully there's some lessons to be learnt for all of us as educators, no matter what level, about keeping these folk engaged and creative.
In higher education, I say actually what's really wonderful is you have a 6-year window.
Yes.
You've got 6 years to get it right.
Yes.
And I think that something that high schools have not had. It sort of came out of nowhere. It was like a tsunami.
Yes.
It sort of came out, and suddenly there's a lot of schools around trying to address how can they make education more relevant and more engaging for this new generation. So I think some very smart universities will be watching very closely to how they adopt and adapt so that by the time they hit the higher education market, they're ready.
Now, you're in Melbourne to present a keynote at our conference tomorrow, and your topic is the next generation education. Could you talk a little bit more about what you think this looks like? We've probably touched on a few points just through discussion, but what do you think your key take-out message of your keynote will be for tomorrow?
I think this is the time where educators have to become very bold, and we have to look really closely at relevance and away from this idea of content. And I think one of the ways we can look at that is look at the way the technologies have converged and merged, and actually new sectors are growing, new opportunities. And I think one of the things we have to look at is product. What is it that we're actually teaching? If you're looking at some of the biggest industries coming through right now, anything from new forms of energy through to artificial intelligence or robotics, new forms of programming, we're looking at aerospace, we're looking at nanotechnology. If you look around, it's very hard to find expert programs in those areas, except for perhaps in Silicon Valley and some new private universities and who are coming through in the States. And I think that is really interesting to see that there's a generation who want to be participating in these new emerging sectors, but we need to make sure our products reflect that in our institutes.
As you will probably remember, we're all about leadership and management at LH Martin Institute, and I'm curious to know what your take on leadership is with the experiences you've had even since finishing the program.
So over the years, I think that I've definitely developed my leadership style significantly, and if I look back, I sort of look back in horror sometimes in my earlier stages of, almost that sort of authoritarian type approach and thinking that was my way of getting credibility, to actually finding now that, I really find that what I'm looking for is transformational change, and actually bringing people along with me in that journey is much better by bringing them alongside me. And so the way I've shifted is now I have a team where there is a lot, it's a very sort of egalitarian environment. People all have a voice. There is, everything is very transparent, so there is also in terms of even our physical working environment, people can choose how they like to work. Do they like their own office, an open space? Do they like to be moving around the country? Do they want to be involved? What hours they work? And everybody has a voice. And I think it's quite interesting how empowering that is when everybody, whether they be somebody who's coming in as a new, perhaps administrator, right through to a very senior member of faculty, it's changed a lot, but I've certainly seen the massive benefit.
I'm also very curious about what we could perhaps term an entrepreneurial mindset. You're clearly an entrepreneur, and us mere mortals are less so. So what I would really like you to explain, if it's possible, to sort of what lies beneath the sort of decisions around from ideation to sort of incubating an idea to bringing it into life. And then I think for me, perhaps the important one of letting it go and moving it on.
Yeah, it's interesting because I never thought of myself as an entrepreneur. I just felt like I was a woman on a mission.
Yes.
And I just kept digging it away. It was one of those things that I suddenly realised that actually it was such a calling for me that I was having to create my own opportunities because they weren't there to fall into.
Yes.
And I'm a great believer of actually bringing some of the more tactical approaches of entrepreneurship from other sectors, so agile methodologies from the tech sector. I love design thinking, the idea of unbundling things and repackaging them up and saying, let's flip things on its head and look at it in a different way. And so going through that process regularly, I find myself catching myself and thinking, am I doing that way because that's how it's always been done, or is it the best way of doing it?
Yes.
And if you get into the habit, you also hire people who love the same way of thinking. You end up in quite a challenging environment in terms of people love to kind of have this great discussions, and they bring about even further incremental benefits and changes. But we also love the concept of failing and fixing.
Yes.
So sometimes you just have to take a blind leap of faith that it may not be perfect, but actually it's perfect enough to test it. And actually, if you can test it, it comes out pretty quickly whether or not it's going to be something that works. And so even within our postgrad program, we have a program that starts every 16 weeks. And so through 300, 400 people at a time. And so 16 weeks later, what we may have taught, while the actual learning outcomes are the same, the way we actually go about it, we may have changed. Yeah. Because actually between the collective team who are teaching, we've found other iterations have changed our approach, or feedback we've had and gained from the students who are teachers have really informed us. So I think that you have to be really agile, and you really have to listen when something's not working. I think the faster you can actually fix it and actually recognise that actually maybe it wasn't quite right, the better you can move forward.
Frances, I'd like to turn your attention now to the Master of Tertiary Education Management that you completed with us in 2013, and just ask you about your experiences of that program and how it may have informed your work since then, and really why you chose it in the first place with all that was going on in your life, and why did you choose our Master of Tertiary Education Management?
So at the time I joined, I was actually one of the busiest periods of my life. I was working as a CEO of an institute that had been acquired by the world's largest private university group, and I was travelling up to 2 weeks of every month around the world. And in some ways you think that's the craziest time to pick up extra studies on top of a family and on top of the geographic distance of New Zealand from where I was travelling to. But I realised that actually I was really starting to see this interest developing around the convergence between technology and education. And I started wanting to dedicate some time to understand better where things were going. And I felt from a discipline point of view, if I formalised it and if I actually put it as part of the studies, I would not just take the curiosity and just sort of run with it, but actually start to validate some of them in some deeper detail. And I don't know that I knew at the time how beneficial that would be. And it was partially because it forced me to take the time to really reflect on what I wanted to do and what was important to me. But it also gave me access to another world of learning that was sitting partially because of the Australian experience with a wonderful group of colleagues and a fantastic cohort, but also in terms of the faculty here. There was really good provocative conversations and some really challenging topics which I really enjoyed.
What do you think you found the most useful out of the program?
I think that for me the aspect of leadership came through that I started to really identify who I was as a leader. It was funny because I'd been a leader for many years, but I'd sort of fallen into it, and I wasn't a person who sort of read leadership books or went to leadership training. I sort of by default took on a role and ran with it because it was my first organisation. It was growing rapidly, and as you're rapidly growing and you've got a number of staff coming on board, you start realising that people need real vision. They need a very clear direction. And it wasn't really until I got into the program I started to really sit back and reflect about who I wanted to be as a leader and who I wanted to work with, and also what do I want people to think about my leadership style. And so I became much more conscious, and I think that was really a fundamental learning for me.
And what was it that you found the most challenging about the program?
Actually, most of the most challenging aspects were logistical. Just trying to make sure that I could get back into Australia in time to take part of the residential program and then be home in time to get my kids, and so it was that juggling act. But again, it became easier over time when you start to realise that you know how it works. That the initial kind of fear of taking on something new disappears. You start having you make friends and the faculty, and so suddenly it becomes actually a really exciting escape from the day-to-day world of running a business.
And what sort of advice might you be able to provide for people thinking about joining us next year in the Master of Tertiary Education Management?
Look, I think this is the time more than ever anyone in education who wants to be leading or be part of the change really need to take the time and actually look at the world as it stands. We are going through transformation, and that process is uncomfortable. It's not impossible, but I think it's when you actually get into a program such as this that actually you can start to really understand where your role fits going forward. And without it, I think that there's a potential risk that you continue to look over your shoulder at what was a legacy model and actually not move forward and not be bold and suddenly be superseded by others coming into the marketplace.
Well, all the best for your keynote tomorrow, and thank you so much for taking time out of your very busy schedule to spend it with me this afternoon. Thank you very much, Frances.
Thank you.